Blizzard's Wake, Chapter 27. Kate was in a frenzy now. The more she was blocked in her effort to reach her father and Jessie, the more determined she became. Stubborn, Jessie called her. Maybe she was. There was nothing in that 100 yards of pasture between the barn and the road except the old windmill about 40 yards down. Even with the clothesline rope and the cord tied together, it would never reach from the barn to the road. But perhaps she could find the windmill. Turning on the flashlight and propping it up against the rusty plow left by the previous owner, Kate took off her mittens and gloves and opened the package of rope with the cord. Carefully, she tied them end to end, testing her square knot to make sure it would hold. She put on her gloves and mittens again and looped the rope around her arm like a lasso. She was cold. In the light from the flashlight, Kate ran around inside the barn until she began to feel she might perspire. She did not want to sweat. She wanted to work out each detail of her plan before she left. If she tied the rope to something in the barn and the other end was around her waist, she could try to reach the windmill. If she did, she would untie the rope from her waist, pull it taut, and tie it to the windmill. Then, holding onto the rope like a handrail, she would follow it back to the barn, untie that end of the rope, tie that end around her waist, and follow it back to the windmill again. The problem was she was wrestling with how she was going to mark her path from the barn to the windmill so that once the rope was untied from the barn, she could still find her way back. On the last lap of the barn's perimeter, she stumbled upon one of the green pickets that used to surround Mother's vegetable garden and saw the rest lying loose and scattered in one corner. Why not use the pickets? Pickets stuck in the snow. She went over her plan again to make sure she thought of everything. She opened one of the barn windows nearest the road and laboriously dumped an armful of pickets on the ground. Another armful and another, the wind grasping at her like some old witch each time she leaned out. Tying one end of her rope to the seat of the rusty plow, she tied the other around her waist and hoisted herself over the sill. She half jumped, half fell in the snow outside. She picked up as many pickets as she could carry and stood for a moment with her back against the barn, trying to get her bearings in the fog of swirling snow. She could only guess the right direction, for the flashlight beam could not penetrate the snow ahead. She might well be wrong, but she started out on what she hoped was the way to the windmill. To Kate, it seemed that the wind was on fiercely intimate terms with her, licking her eyelids with an insistent tongue, probing under the edge of her red flannel scarf as though trying to uncover her neck, forcing itself up the sleeves of her heavy jacket. Despite the sweater she wore beneath, Kate kept going. She felt the snow deepening suddenly as she sank in up to her knees and then her thighs. She was suddenly closer to the ditch out by the road than she'd imagined, or the snow was piled up against something. The drift getting deeper and deeper, and then, to her utter amazement, she bumped something against her knee, followed by her shoulder. She put out one hand, and even through the layers of leather and wool, she could feel metal supporters of the windmill. Pure blind luck. As much as she'd wanted to find it, however, now she wondered if she could go on. She estimated she'd left the house 40 or 50 minutes ago, and even under all her clothing, prepared as she was for sub-zero weather, she'd never felt this cold. Every moment she made was awkward, every step she took cumbersome. What would have been a simple task in normal temperatures and daylight hours, untying the end of the rope from around her waist, pulling it taut so she could follow it back to the barn, and fastening it to the windmill, became a project that tried her patience. First, she had dropped the picket she'd been carrying. Then she took the flashlight from her coat pocket, removed the scarf from her face, turned on the flashlight, and held it in her mouth. She took off her mittens, pulling the rope as tight as she could, then tied it to the windmill. When she'd succeeded at last, she put her mittens back on, thrust the flashlight in her pocket, picked up the pickets, and made her way back along the top rope, placing pickets in the snow beneath the line, anchoring them securely so she could find them again. When she reached the barn, she climbed back in, untied the rope from the plow, tied it around her waist, and climbed back out. She'd toyed with the idea of running around inside the barn to warm herself, but was too worried now about Jessie and her dad. If she was this cold, having only been out an hour or so, what was happening to them? Scooping up from the snow outside and the window all of the remaining pickets she could carry, She followed the one she had already stuck in the snow, the rope going slack. Fear reared inside of her. What if the wind blew them over? What if she got out as far as the windmill and couldn't find her way back? The snow should have brightened the landscape. She could remember nights when, standing outside after a new snow, the round moon with a large white eye in the sky, she'd felt she could see everything as clear as day. But now the wind blowing snow made a whiteout. Only now and then, when the wind died for a moment, did she think that she saw a tall gray outline of the windmill. But it disappeared again in the next gust. There was only one other landmark that might guide her, the pine tree at the end of the driveway. But she could not see that at all. When she last reached the windmill, she dropped her second load of pickets, catching her thumb on the round metal eye at the top of one, the picket that Mother had used to latch the makeshift gate to the fence around her garden. Then, feeding her way around on her hands and feet, she moved around the base of the windmill until she came to the pump that brought up the water for the horse trough. She stood very still. If the pump was here and the windmill was there, that meant that she would be facing south, and the road was east of the barn. She turned towards east, and then, walking sideways to keep the direction straight in her mind, she blindly retraced her steps back to the pile of pickets, gathered them up in her arms, and set out for what she hoped would be the road, and the place she imagined the car to be. With every other step, she pushed a picket into the snow, her burden growing lighter as she went. Yet she was not at all sure she was heading the right way. She had to stop every so often and disentangle the dangling rope from a picket. If she did not reach the road, she might have to backtrack and remove all the stakes, starting out in another direction. She turned on her flashlight, and again the blowing snow was impenetrable. Her father's car could be right in front of her nose, and she could walk right past it. To her dismay, she ran out of pickets. She had lost some in the snow, she knew. There was still a few yards of rope left, she guessed, and she moved gingerly around, trying to reach the fence by the ditch. Hoping her calculations were off and it might be closer than she expected, that if she got this far, she might somehow be able to see the car, but the rope became taut. She could go no further. The road, she guessed, was still 50 feet away. In frustration and disappointment, she felt tears welling up and immediately checked herself. They could only freeze her eyelids shut. She could not afford the luxury of crying. She shouted instead. "Dad!" she screamed, turning in one direction, then in another, her eyes scanning the place she thought the road might be. "Jessie! Dad! Jessie!" over and over. And then, to her left, perhaps 20 yards from where she stood, she saw a faint gleam of yellow light flash on and off from behind the snow.